So yeah, the reader bridging the gap between panels is called closure, and it's central to how comics communicate narrative. It encourages an active, engaged reading in story, even when there are no words present. That's why the comics are a brilliant tool for reluctant readers, because comics force the reader to think, to interpret, to imagine. At first glance, individual panels in comics are static. They represent a frozen moment. It's almost like a strobe effect is going off, like a flash. Bang, you've caught this moment. We see a glimpse of movement maybe, but it's really an illusion. In fact, comics can communicate both cause and effect of an action in a single panel. So here's 3 quick examples. Peanuts again, very early. Here we see the golf shot. We see the follow-through. We see the impact. We see the vase breaking. We see the bits flying off. We read the sound effect. We see the ball fly off. We see Charlie Brown levitating off the ground in shock, and his hat levitating off his head. Quite a jaunty little number he's got there. All of that in a single panel, cause and effect, the whole path, everything is all applied from here to here. It takes you around in a lovely loop, cause and effect. So here is another one. This is Tintin. We see Tintin fire his pistol. We see the gun smoke and the muzzle flash. We see the bottle explode. We see the bits rain down. We see the sound effect. And we see Snowy the dog reacting to what he's seeing up here. All of that in a single panel. A frozen moment, and yet you're actually seeing what's about two seconds worth effectively of all that going on, but it's all represented in a single image. This is a panel from Watchmen. And this is the first time that we actually have dialogue, because once you add dialogue in, that becomes another layer of how time operates in a comic panel or in comics panels. Time in this panel flows up or backwards from the bottom of the panel to the top. Because what's going on here? It's in Vietnam, the comedian, he's got this woman pregnant, he's about to dump her and head back to America. She's unimpressed by this, unsurprisingly. She is breaking a bottle and she's about to slash him in the face with it, which is why he ends up with scar thereafter in the story. She smashes the bottle, he hears the sound and reacts, looking over his shoulder and saying, huh, what's? The next panel, across the face. This happens first, but you read that first. You read, huh, what? Because your eye goes to that. And then you read down the panel and you see what's happened. But you don't think this is backwards. Time is running backwards in this panel. You just process that. You just look at it and go, all right, it's a totality for you. And this is just a single panel in like a 400-page graphic novel that's just chock full of brilliant moments like this. Which is the reason why it is a classic and has towered over the superhero genre ever since. But it's moments like this that you read all of this, you register everything that's happening, you don't even notice that it's going on. Everything's shown here, it's all cause and effect, all shown in a single panel. The one thing you can't do, and the mistake that people will make when they start out in comics, is they try and show consecutive actions in a single panel. People will write, and somebody writing a script will ask for consecutive actions, and you can't do it. You can't write in a script, David walks into the room, David picks up the glass of water, David drinks the glass of water, David wipes his mouth. You can't do that in one panel. That's consecutive actions, that's not cause and effect. Cause and effect, you can show. Consecutive actions, you can't, and it's a strange distinction. But, yeah. Anyway, I'll mention that. Okay, so we've talked about closure. We've talked about how cause and effect works in panels. The other thing that you get, this panel from Watchmen is a good example of, is narrative density. Is that you can achieve a lot of things very quickly. The old cliche, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Absolutely. And that's one of the strengths of comics. It's a visual medium. But you can say the same is true of film or video or games. You can show us something and we can see it all and process it all. The advantage that comics has is not only can you have that, we can also be privy to the thoughts of the characters just as you can in a novel, because we can have internal monologues which can appear in caption boxes, or if you're feeling old school, you can have a thought bubble and we can hear the thoughts bubbling up from inside. A bit out of fashion at the moment, but I quite like it. So you can have the strengths of the novel and the strengths of the visual operating at the same time in a story. So you can pack this density right down through what we see, through what we read, and what we infer, all from a single image or from a series of images telling the story in sequence. And then the last thing to talk about is, in that regard, is amplification, which is how words and pictures working together tell far more than they can on their own. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts in comics, which is what gives it the ability to tell massive stories in just a few panels or pages. I don't know if anybody read the stories in The Guardian. Some of them were brilliant, some of them but they managed to tell quite huge stories in just a few pages, whereas if you tried to do the same thing in a short story, it would take thousands of words to achieve the same effect. Because you can shortcut so much of that through amplification. So, one last thing I want to talk about with regard to how comics tell narrative currently. And that's, in comics, space equals time. That's a hard one to wrap your head around. I can just say that and it doesn't mean anything per se. But space equals time, and I'm going to show you what that means. It's in the way that panels are structured on a page or across multiple pages. Comics present a kind of temporal map. They suggest to you the speed and the rate at which time is passing that you're seeing in front of you. Individual panels have an implied time signature, both in the image that you're seeing, maybe in the text, or how long it takes you to read the text, or how much somebody's saying or thinking in the panel, and also in their relationship to the panels either side of them. What time has passed between this panel and the next, what time has passed between that panel and the one after it. So that's one thing. And even the way panels are arranged on a page has a further impact on how you perceive the passage of time in the context of that page. So space alters your perception of the passage of time. And I will show you a couple of examples of how this works. Because we've already seen how time can flow up a panel and watch them. So this is a pretty standard 2x3 grid. 6 panels on the page. This is again from Cerebus the Aardvark, where he's borrowed a character from Giles and turned her into a bit of a monster, frankly, although she wasn't that nice in Giles to start with. But what happens here is that all the panels are the same size. What this does is this suggests a kind of neutral time. Aside from how long it takes you to read the dialogue, you look, and you assume that all of these are taking roughly the same time to pass. Time is just moving normally. It's neutral time, okay? Next example. Now we move to widescreen. This has got the same number of panels as the previous page, but it reads slower. It's actually got less dialogue than the previous page, but it reads slower, and that's to do with how we read in Western cultures, because we read from left to right, so you read across the page in a sort of Z formation effectively. Now, I'll take you back to the previous one. There, you went 1, 2, 3, then you had to come down here, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so your eye travelled across the page, and then back, and then across the page, and off you were gone. Now, you're reading the whole of the panel, and the panel's widescreen, so you read across the first panel, and then back to here, and across the second panel, and then back to here, and so on, and so on, and so on. So it slows your eye down. Widescreen storytelling in comics, also known as decompression sometimes, slows down your perception of the speed at which time is passing, because it slows down how it's work using the mechanics of how you actually read the page, and it's altering your perception of time by forcing you to read in this particular way. So space equals time, and that's through what happens in the panel, how much text there is in the panel, but also how panels are arranged on the page. Also the impact that you have from going from the first one to the second one would alter your perception from one page to the next, that contrast. And the third example here is we start with this character has just had a stroke. She realises here, because his face, although you can't really see it, his face is slightly skew on one side. And she realises, she's going, Tara, I'm sorry, it's all my fault, Tara. So what's happening here is a sort of a sense of escalation. Things are speeding up. The impact, the import of events is changing. The more space a panel is given, when storytelling is done well, the more importance it seems to have, the bigger the moment becomes. The space equals time equals the significance of the moment as well. So it's not just that space equals time, space equals significance. Story import is going on here. We'll go Tara screaming. That's from The Now of Brown by Glenn Dillon, won a big prize at the Angoulême Book Festival, Graphic Novels Festival in France last year, and it's a blinding book if you ever get a chance to read it. He's working on the new Star Wars film at the moment. Okay, so that's talking about how comics work, how space equals time in comics. Now let's talk about how, quite quickly, how digital. So this is created by a guy called Randall Munroe, 2005, went viral a couple of years later. And he was just making these little stickman cartoons because Randall can't draw. Like me, he really can't draw at all. But now he actually makes a living writing and drawing these from the merchandising that he gets from these. But this is sort of typical of what happened when we got webcomics and digital started to get to the point where people had access to the internet and could look at things online. Because of dial-up speeds, because the difficulties that people had, their computers weren't up to loading huge file sizes in the good old days, comics, when they went digital, had to be incredibly simplistic. Black and white, not colour, because it affected file size. If you were lucky, you got 3-panel comedy strips, just like the old newspaper, like the Katzenjammer Kids in the 19th century, because that was all the computer could cope with without killing your computer stone dead or making you go make a cup of tea while you wait for the page to load in the good old days. So comics, although they started trying to adapt to this new technology that was emerging, the problem was the technology wasn't up to the job of supporting comics as a medium of any complexity or any length of storytelling. So they adapted to fit the emerging technology as it came along. Now, things moved on from there, fortunately for us. And people started doing web comics, increasingly sophisticated comics, to be read on the web. So this is Scott McCloud. These are 2 examples from Zot, which he did online. And with a bit of luck, this will actually work. So here, this is an example of parallel narratives. So he's got one storyline going here, this character Zot, am I dreaming? Meanwhile, we have this other storyline going on, hey Jenny, ready to go, Nana's waiting in the car, I'll just be a second dad, etc. So these 2 storylines roll alongside each other, and you cut back and forth between the 2, and as the vertical slider bar becomes your tool for navigating through the story. So you have 2 parallel narratives, but what you get is the contrast happening between the 2. Now you could do this on paper, but it has a lovely elegance on the web that it wouldn't necessarily have on paper because of how you would pace it and how you would turn the pages. This is a webcomic called Six Gun. And again, this is using a kind of fraction narrative, and it gives you as the reader the choice what order you want to read the different elements in. So you can click different parts of it. So if we click this character here, it takes us through to a lineup of 5 images, and then there's navigation here with the priest who's got the head of a horse. I don't know why, it just does. So his story scrolls down like that, and this one scrolls up, and there's more. It continues in that vein. So that uses quite a fractured narrative. You can read it in whatever order you want, and as you pull the individual panels up and down, that affects the images around it. So that's Six Gun, that's one experiment that's been done. Next is, okay, so this is Treasure, this is branching narrative. So this is a pirate ship, and they've got cannons, and then you can choose which direction you want the story to go. You can go to this guy over here, or you can go here. They can fire cannon, the balls will go through the air, this hits a bird, the bird falls down, hits the water here, lands on Treasure Island. This guy has a meal, he's very happy, and he gets to survive, and it becomes Hawaii, as you do. And so on. So you can see here, we start from this point here, but the narrative branches down here, or it goes this way, or you can follow it all the way up. There's a coin, and it leads to a guy, and there's we end up with like a detective noir story, and then finally the detective says, oh, I'll tell you a story, and the story is this story. So it's circular, it takes you back to where it begins again. I mean, it's not hugely groundbreaking in terms of branching narrative or interactivity, but it's a start, and it's relatively early primitive webcomics of what can be done. This is something called motion books. This is where people try and put sound and animation into comics. This almost never goes well. This almost never goes well because it breaks the fundamental rule that space equals time. Because sound and animation, both of them alter they take time to happen. If you're going to have sound, as Simon was saying with the 39 steps, it slows things down because you have to experience sound and you have to see animation happen. So you can't, your pace, the pace at which you're reading a story is disrupted because you insert these things in. Now, Made Fire, it's a lovely guy who runs it called Liam, who I've known for donkey's years, and he's very nice, and he really proselytizes for this. But I'm about to show you why I don't necessarily think it's the best idea in the world. Aside from the fact, if you leave this music will just play forever, and you're just stuck on this panel. But you could. Becomes a bit over dramatic after a while. So you have to click through. Aside from the fact that the whack sound effect is a bit more convincing than whatever sound effect they had on the soundtrack, like me dropping my keys on the floor, what you actually have here is you have a massive repetition. You have redundancy upon redundancy. Because what you have is, we can see, we don't need a sound effect to tell us that he's just whacked the gun out of his hand. But if you're going to have the sound, don't have the sound effect as well. I mean, it's as if we're trying to cater for every possible audience. It's like comics for the deaf or something. But yeah, you've broken how story is being told. You've broken because it's about how time flows, the perception of time. If you insert all these other things into it, you're turning it into bad animatics. It's like storyboard brought to life. It stops having the strengths of what comics had in the first place, or it warps or alters them. In my opinion. Sorry, I get very angry about this stuff. And that's a classic example of why it's a bad idea. And it's been tried many times. I don't know if anybody remembers this gem from 1996. This was before we even could go online. This was called Fun Online. And this was a real early adopter, loss leader, first through the wall and get bloody attempt to come up with CD-ROM comics with animation and sound. Oh, such a bad idea. And this is, you would buy it and it would have reviews and bits about games, and then you plug your CD into your computer and you could listen and watch the comic happen in front of you. So it just turned comics into bad animation. When you put sound and or animation into comics, it fundamentally alters how they're read, because they can only be represented through time. But in comics, space equals time, so disrupting that flow sabotages how space and time are being presented to the reader. Whereas a better solution is to treat the screen as a window through which comics can flow, either up and down or sideways, or on a diagonal, or in a big circle, or whatever. So the screen is just a window that you see. Like early comics often just try to take the page and stick it into the computer screen. And since they're actually the wrong shape for each other, you then had this, before tablets, comics turned on its side, you had to chop the comic page into half to present it. And it's wrong, because it just didn't work. So instead, if you treat the outside of the screen as the frame, as sort of this infinite canvas that can flow through in any direction you want, it's far more successful. You can have interactive narratives where the reader chooses the journey their story follows. You can have branching narratives, absolutely, as we saw very quickly with Treasure. But of course, as with many computer games, as Simon mentioned, this illusion of choice is often just that, it's an illusion, or the appearance of choice is often an illusion, because branching narratives will tend to be more like, a vine wrapping themselves around the tree. You know all of this. And the outcome is generally fixed to a few or one result. And this is especially so in comics, even if they're digital, because if you're going to have a true branching narrative, or God forbid, a sandbox comic, somebody has to draw everything. And it just can't be done. You can't draw every possibility. It would just take forever. There has to be some control over shape and end point for it to function. So there are limits to how interactivity works. Of course, anybody seen this? This is Building Stories by Chris Ware. This is a graphic novel that comes in a big box. I was going to bring it along, but it's this huge, bulky thing. And inside it is 14 different kinds of story. Some of them are a proper graphic novel, some is a comic, some are a pamphlet, some is just a postcard, but they've all got a story. So there's 14 different stories about 3 women living in this building. And you can read it in any order you want. And the order you read it in affects your response to the narrative. Because in some, a character's dead, and in others, the character hasn't died yet, but if you know that the character's going to die, suddenly you have all this dramatic irony of reading about their hopes and dreams and aspirations, and you know the character's going to die, but they don't know that yet. You know how they're going to die. But if you read it in a different order, you could read them and their hopes and aspirations, and you haven't read the fact they're dead yet, and you're like, oh, isn't that nice? And then they die in the next piece that you read, and it's like, oh, that's a bit sad now. So it alters how you read building stories, alters your perception of the character in the story, and it generates different levels and layers and styles of irony and dramatic irony and suspense going on as a consequence. Where are we going? Where are we now? Where are we going? So web and digital. So web, obviously, comics to be read online. Digital, comics to be downloaded and read on your own tablet or your iPhone or your whatever you're going to read it on. So I gave a version of this talk 4.5 years ago. We didn't even have the iPad then. It was just rumours that it was going to come. People were trying to read comics on the iPod Touch, which was a bit of a clunky method for reading comics. It has to be so tiny. But yeah, the iPad is changing, and other tablets are changing how comics are read and consumed, and how people are responding to them. There is still a tendency to treat this as just a version of a page, and then click like it's a Kindle or something. You're just going to scroll through. Where the other ways of telling stories, they haven't truly been embraced for this method yet. Web comics are doing it far better than digital comics are right now. But what is changing is the links between the medium and the means of distribution are changing how people are creating comics and for what audience they're creating comics. Because you can read web comics anywhere, because you can download digital comics from anywhere in the world. If you've got a credit card and reliable broadband, he said optimistically, as if that's the entire world, hope. Frankly, I struggle in parts of Scotland. But yes, you can, it democratizes distribution. It means that you can find comics from almost anywhere in the world, and you can read almost any comics from anywhere in the world. The problem is the signal to noise ratio of quality to crap that is available for you to read. And then it's about storefronts, digital storefronts. Probably the leading digital storefront until Saturday was called Comixology. But a month ago it was acquired by Amazon, and that has somewhat screwed the pooch, it has to be said, because Amazon didn't want to be paying 30% to Apple for people to be buying comics through the Comixology app. So instead they just made it a conduit through to the Comixology website, which they now own. And that's fine if you're Marvel or DC or other big publishers where you can make some noise for yourself. But for small independents, Comixology was brilliant because it had the capacity to put them on an equal footing with the big players in the marketplace. You could find anything, you could browse and you could buy it instantaneously. Now you have to fanny about and click to get to what you want to find and then to buy it. They've just made it so much harder, and it's all just a pissing contest between Apple and Amazon, and unfortunately digital comics are going to suffer as a consequence of it. But there are ways around this. Here we have Freak Angels. This is a web comic. It was written by Warren Ellis, drawn by Paul Duffield. That ran for nearly 900 pages. You can read the whole thing for free online. It's all free, it's all available to read online. It was published weekly, 6-page installments, totally serialized. But what they discovered was people could read it for free. You can still read it, it's all there. And it's quite good actually. But people wanted to buy a book of it. People would read it for free online, and then they wanted to buy the book of it afterwards, the collection of it. So you can buy the big boxed edition of Freak Angels, all 900 odd pages of it. They sold 50,000 copies of the first book, despite the fact you can read it for free. So they've discovered that free digital distribution does not cannibalize paper sales. The two work in harmony with each other. So that's one thing. Here we have The Private Eye by Brian K. Vaughan and Marcus Martin. And this is DRM-free comics. It's name your own price comics. Sort of the humble bundle, effectively, but this is a standalone. So you can download this, it's published as a series of issues, you can pay whatever price you want for it. It's DRM free because then you can port it around between all your devices without getting into an Android versus iOS scrap. And that's proven quite successful, helps, it's really good as well. Image, I think today, announced that they're doing their own humble bundle whereby you can buy a bunch of different Image comics. You can choose from your selection and you can pay, I think you set your own price for this, I think that's how it works from memory. Or it's a very low price, but you can get a selection, go in a bundle. So that's altering how people are done. We talked about comicsology, but it doesn't just have to be superheroes. There's an app called Sequential. So if you were, which absolutely has no superheroes on it at all. So they will have From Hell by Alan Moore. I think they have V for Vendetta, but they don't have Watchmen because it's got men in tights and capes hitting each other. So they have a clear line between capes, this side, everybody else, this side. It is weird in comics that capes and tights is called mainstream, whereas to me it just looks like wrestlers. But hey ho. And everything else is the alternative or indie comics. And that's just determined by past sales, but that's not the shape of the future. So, frankly, it's almost impossible to predict where this is going and what's going to happen. I think DRM-free is going to change things. I think there will be conglomerations, there will be corporations that will take over elements of it, and it's how people get the word out about what they're doing. And social media is going to be the way for people to create and build an audience for it. So it's going to have to be word of mouth, but digital word of mouth. But digital and web comics are going to save comics as a medium because they were completely dying before the advent of web and digital. But they've altered what's possible, they've altered the means of distribution, they've altered even the price point for how comics can be purchased and the rewards creators can get from that. So the landscape is completely altered in the last 12 years, 15 years I would say. So that's Scott. And I'll show you one last thing before lunch, just because I love this so much. This is called Pup Ponders the Heat Death of the Universe, which is just one of my all-time favourite web comics, and I'm just showing it to you